Welcome once again to our worship here at the Meaford Church of Christ. I want to thank you for joining us. And just a couple of brief announcements. We are canceled for this week and next week for sure. We'll reassess when we get closer to the end of January whether we are meeting again. That'll largely relate to the number of people in hospitals more so than case counts. But we do want to be aware and be at least mitigate risk. There's always a certain level of risk, and we just want to take it easy. So I wanted to point that out first of all. A reminder again of our midweek Bible studies. We have the men's study on Thursdays, ladies' study on Wednesdays. With the men's class, we're studying a book that the title is, anyway, it's a book about baptism, quite an interesting read. Anyone who wants that book, I have a digital version of it, so I can email it out to you. Even if you don't want to participate in the class, you may be interested in reading that book. So I'll put that offer out there. Finally, keep in mind that kids are still out of school. So be careful when driving, be patient, realize they could be tobogganing or out playing road hockey or whatever the case may be. They have some online learning, but it tends to take up less time. So just be aware of that as well. For everything else, please go ahead and check your bulletin. If you're not local here, that's okay. The bulletin will be more things that are relevant to the Meaford congregation. Okay, with all of that said, I would ask you to take a minute, do whatever you need to do, pause the video, do whatever you need to do to prepare for the Lord's table, and we will take a couple of moments to reflect on the emblems together. Let's look at Matthew chapter 26, a passage we've looked at many, many times, but a simple, helpful summary of the Lord's table can be found there, beginning in verse 26. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And when he took a cup, and when he'd given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." Of course, we understand that as members of Christ's kingdom today, we partake and Jesus partakes along with us. Now, it's sad that we're not meeting in person, and I know that's frustrating to many, myself included, but we can partake of these emblems together. And as we do, I would encourage you to think of all of those who are also watching this or not watching this, but are conducting their own at-home church service and partaking of those emblems, and that we still have a demonstration of fellowship and unity as we partake together. I hope that's helpful as you think about the sacrifice of Christ and reflect on the impact that it has on your life. I want to start today's lesson by sharing a couple of principles that I suspect are pretty broadly accepted for the most part. Okay, maybe people don't realize all the implications of these truths, but the two things that I want to share with you, the two ideas, the two principles, are that human life has value and that all human beings are equal and should be treated as equals. These principles relate directly to a functioning society. They relate to human rights, an issue that is a major, talking point in our time. And this is something that I think even around the world people generally buy into. Let me read from the UN page on human rights. It says, "Human rights are rights that are inherent to all human beings regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more." Now, we could question some of those rights, because I would suggest to you philosophically that anything that takes the work of somebody else, you do not have a right to that. So that's not a thing. I'm sorry. Now, with that said, they go on to say that everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. And that's where I think an important point is made. All right. The idea that people are equal, that people should be treated in the same way, that we shouldn't be discriminating, is a valuable and worthwhile truth. Now, I will say this, as I reflect on what the UN says about human rights versus a far superior document, frankly, as I look at the US Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, I would suggest that it does a much better job of delineating real rights that belong to each person for no other reason than the fact that they are a person. Okay. And by the way, I would say the U.S. documentation, the founding documents of the U.S., do a better job of getting the message across, and they use fewer words, but perhaps have even greater implications than the words used by the UN. Now, I want to emphasize today this idea of human beings being treated in a particular way. Right? We tend to think about this and associate this with a civilized society. We associate negligence in regards to human life and human dignity and human equality as barbaric, as backward, as uncivilized, and rightly so. But the question is, why do we do that? Okay, for many of you watching this, you'll associate this with Western civilization, and you know, you could probably sort of narrow down Western civilization to Aristotelian logic and a Judeo-Christian moral code, and that wouldn't be that far. We're not going to spend much time on the logic side or the law side, which perhaps, you know, comes in from the Romans as well, but we will spend time on the moral side, because I would suggest to you that the kind of freedoms available in a what we think of as a free and good society are hinged upon, are reliant upon the concepts that all human beings are equal, okay, and that all human beings have value. And we think of that as part of being civilized, but I would suggest to you that that's not exactly the case. Rather, those principles are not just civilized principles, they are Christian principles. And apart from societies that have been heavily influenced by Christianity, you will not find those kinds of values reflected. And so I want to deal with these one by one and tease out some of the implications. And I think this is an important conversation to have, because I think of all the various subjects that we could use to share the gospel, to share God's love, to share God's truth, this may be one of the most powerful, because everyone I've met, okay, maybe there are some people out there who don't buy into these ideas that humans have value, that humans should be treated equally. But everyone that I've met and interacted with believes this stuff. And so I think there's a great deal of value in being able to articulate how those values are right, okay, but how they're hinged upon, dependent upon a Christian worldview. All right. And through that avenue, I suspect there may be people who we could bring to Christ by sharing this important truth with them. And so let's begin with number one. Human life has value. Human life has value. We know this as Christians from Scripture, and we base this on the idea in Genesis chapter 1:27 that God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. We go on to read in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, where God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living creature. See, man in these particular ways is distinct from the animals. Right? This is an important difference. The wise man, of course, says that the dust returns to the earth, but the spirit returns to God who gave it. Again, we have this idea that's emphasized, that God gives life. All right. Now, by the way, I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I do have a bit of a cold. It's not anything more than a cold. I went ahead and took a test, so everything's fine. But you'll probably hear it in my voice, and you may hear a little sniffle. I'm going to try my best not to do that. Okay. Genesis 9:6, God commands that whoever sheds the blood of man, his blood will be shed by man. Because again, God says God made man in his image. He makes a special link, okay, that taking a human life is different from taking other lives, because human lives are given by God and reflect the image of God. And so based on all of these passages, we understand that human life has special value, that it's not to be taken lightly or treated trivially, but rather it's to be respected and viewed as sacred. And that is right. Now, with that said, most people in our society would probably agree with this, although there's one glaring exception. However, you should understand that this has not been the way of viewing this through history, right? And we could give tons and tons and tons of examples. And I'm just going to pick on a very short few. Okay, in China, when they were building the Great Wall, the stories are told of how many people died during the construction of the Great Wall of China. And when they died, they just put them in with the rubble of the wall and carried on building, because human life was not viewed as sacred. In North America, colonial North America, when native tribes were warring with each other, okay, when they came into another village and took over the village, they would take those who were old enough to be slaves. Those who were too young to be slaves would be killed. Because, and there's a practical side to this, but this is actually helps to make the point. Because these were nomadic tribes, you had to be able to keep up with this moving tribe, or you were just dead weight and they would kill you. Yes, women, children, infants, everything. They killed everyone who could not keep up with the nomadic nature of the tribe, because there was no special sacredness to human life, right? We know, for example, that the Spartans practiced eugenics. That is, babies who didn't meet this special Spartan standard for their warriors, they just killed them. In Roman times, the Romans, if a baby that was unwanted, they would just throw that child into the street. Masters could kill slaves on a whim. Okay, so these societies, even great societies like Greece and Rome, did not have the same sacred view of human life that they ought to have had, and certainly that most people in Western societies do have. And those Western societies have that special value placed on human life because of the influence of Christianity on those societies. I want you to think for a moment about the last funeral you attended, the reverence and the respect shown. Because we understand that that life meant something, that life had value. And we are right to honor those lives. Today, our society has become largely disconnected from this eternal truth. And while people still hold on to some sensibility, and we retain some memory of the biblical mandate that life comes from God, even now in Canada, it is legal to kill a child that has been partially through the birth canal. That is a full-term pregnancy, the child is being born, and then in that last moment before the child fully clears the birth canal, it is legal to kill that infant. We do similar things, and we're moving in a direction quickly toward doing even more things with those who are aged and who are dealing with various terminal illnesses or even life-altering illnesses that make them just too inconvenient for society to have to deal with. I would remind you that it was Christians who collected those babies thrown into the streets of Roman cities to die and loved them and raised them. It must be Christians today who take a stand for life, who help friends and neighbors, and anyone who will listen to understand that human life is sacred and must be valued if a society is to remain civil, if a society is to remain to any degree Christian. And so the second principle, we talked about the value of human life. The second principle is the equality of mankind. We again understand in light of creation, in light of Genesis 1:26 that we read a moment ago, that humans are equal. The Hebrews author says that we're created a little lower than the angels. We know from John 3:16, the most famous passage perhaps in all of Scripture, that God loves all mankind. God loved the world, the whole world. That's all the people, right? 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, God desires everyone to come to salvation. Paul, of course, describes in Galatians 3:27 that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. There's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And of course, we might say, as we apply this not just to the Christian church, the Christian world, we apply this to everyone. The opposite is also true. Right? The point of the passage is God does not value one person above another because of their race or their ethnicity or their gender or any other immutable characteristic. Right? What God looks for from all mankind is a response to the gospel that he has delivered, to the plan of salvation that he has carried out. That's what matters. We are all equal, either all equally lost or equally saved. And so we can't put one person above another. Even those of us, of course, who are saved are in a better situation eternally than those who are not, but we're not in that situation because we're superior, only because of what God has done and because we have been willing to take advantage of that. Now, interestingly, in the founding documents of our neighbors to the south, down in the U.S., we find the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," just as we've been saying, and of course, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. I want you to notice that the conclusions that are carried out in the rest of America's founding documents are hinged upon the fact that men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with these rights. If you remove the concept of a Creator, you have a real problem. And for many societies, that problem was real. Right? Ancient historian Thucydides, I'm probably saying that wrong, I'm not even going to try, stated that right as the world goes is only in question between equals in power. While the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. So catch that, right? Doing the right thing is only something to be discussed between equals because the strong can do whatever they want to the weak. Thrasymachus claimed that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. Callicles, by the way, there are other Greek philosophers and Roman philosophers who argued similar things, argued that the strong should rule the weak as a right owed to their superiority. And I'm sure many watching this are familiar with the concept of nobility, in which those who were of noble birth literally believed that they were above everyone else, that they rightly held the seats of power. And so, outside of a Christian worldview, it has not been the case that all men are created equal. It's been the case that no, the strong rule the weak. If you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, it's for a reason, and you ought to, and the people at the top of the power hierarchy can and should do whatever they want. Even today, we know the caste system is widely accepted and practiced in India, despite the fact that the government has tried to pass laws about that. Right? The only hope for India is not laws. Government can't do anything about it. They need to accept the gospel. They need to accept the truth that God has created all men equal. Now, I want to add a further qualification. So I've given a lot of old references. But we should keep in mind that some of the worst atrocities committed in the name of inequality, committed in the name that some people are superior to others, okay, have been committed not in ancient times, but within the last 100 years. I want to read what is probably one of my favorite quotes along these lines. And I forgive me for reading, but I want to share it with you. It's too good for me not to share it. David Berlinski, in his excellent book, The Devil's Delusion, tells a story and then concludes the story with a description. It reads as follows. In the early days of the German advance into Eastern Europe, before the possibility of Soviet retribution even entered their untroubled imagination, Nazi extermination squads would sweep into villages, and after forcing villagers to dig their own graves, murder their victims with machine guns. On one such occasion, somewhere in Europe, an SS officer watched languidly as with his machine gun cradled. An elderly, bearded Hasidic Jew laboriously dug what he knew to be his own grave. Standing up straight, he addressed his executioner. God is watching what you are doing, is what he said. And then he was shot dead. What Hitler did not believe, and what Stalin did not believe, and what Mao did not believe, and what the SS did not believe, and what the Gestapo did not believe, and what the NKVD did not believe, and what the commissaires, functionaries, swaggering executioners, Nazi doctors, Communist Party theoreticians, intellectuals, brown shirts, black shirts, Gutierrez, and 1,000 party hacks did not believe was that God was watching what they were doing. And as far as we can tell, very few of those carrying out the horrors of the 20th century worried over much that God was watching what they were doing either. After all, that is the meaning of a secular society. Before leaving this point completely, I want to speak for a moment to those who consider themselves to be in the woke crowd, the critical race theorists, the proud progressives. The rights that you claim to be in favor of, the social justice that you claim to be seeking, is only found in a world where men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. True justice is defined and found only in God and only through His truth. You cannot and should not It should be considered a moral evil to categorize people based on race or color or gender or sexual preference or socioeconomic status. There are only two meaningful categories of human beings, and those are saved and lost. To divide people by any categories other than those is wickedness. Now, we're fortunate to live in a society that has experienced the benefit of a worldview that allows for human flourishing. The key components of that worldview relate to the nature of man. There are things we could add for sure. But the two principles that we have emphasized today, that human life has value and must be respected, and that all men are equal and have to be treated as such, those two values are absolutely central to the continuation of Western civilization at all. And as we move further from the God who created us, from understanding the world as his creation, from understanding our fellow man as fellow created beings in his nature, the more secular we become. You need to understand that those rights that you claim to value so much are going to go right along with the God who grants those rights. And so, if you feel like you need to be in a rush toward a secular society, I would urge you to rethink. Of course, I understand that many watching this are Christian people. And for you, I know that it is difficult to address some of these things in conversation. I know that bringing up truth about God in an environment such as ours can have some negative consequences. However, I do think that we can make some real headway by emphasizing the fact that these rights that all of our friends and neighbors and family members claim to believe in, these rights are only legitimate, can only be maintained in a society that believes in God. Specifically, a society that believes in the God described in this book. And so I think you can find opportunity to share God's truth with people as you take common cause with them in matters related to human dignity and human rights. Yes, I understand that many go way off the deep end and they buy into horrible communist-like theories, Marxist, I should have said, theories that are not helpful to society. I get that. But perhaps if we start with the end goal in mind, I think that's the common ground. All of us want human flourishing. All of us want a society where people are equal, where lives are valued, where people are shown dignity and respect and even love. And if you start there and demonstrate how a secular worldview cannot deliver that, we can find a great opportunity to reach people who desperately need God's truth, to reach a society that has collectively made a decision to move away from the very foundation that made them what they are. And so I hope that you will seek those opportunities, pray for those opportunities, and engage in those conversations despite the fact that they may be challenging.